This episode of Behind the Regs is sponsored by Plan Checker. Plan Checker is a UK-based digital platform designed to connect clients with verified building control and construction professionals, making it easier to find the right expertise at the right time for the right job. It doesn't replace building control bodies and it doesn't carry out restricted activities or functions. It simply creates clearer, more transparent access to the professionals working across the industry. If you're a professional, a client, or part of the wider built environment sector, you can learn more or sign up at planchecker.co.uk.
Welcome to Behind the Regs. Today we are joined by John Miles. We've got the same hosts as usual, myself, Jack, and Nada. So, John, for anyone that doesn't know who you are, would you be able to give us a quick introduction on yourself, your background, and where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely fine. So I started my building control journey in too long ago to remember really, in the mid-90s. So we had some work done at home and I liked understanding how buildings came together, and decided that was a career path I was going to go down, not quite understanding which, but construction industry was going to be my path. So I embarked on a construction course at college, went to Sheffield Hallam University, and did a degree in building surveying. And in that placement year, I worked for a building surveying practice who had an office in Birmingham called Bailey Garner. And whilst working for them, I got involved in making building reg submissions, dealing with the needs of the public in terms of buildings, and made the decision after chatting with a colleague that a foundation in the legislation in building control is a good foundation for a career across the construction sector. So at that point, I decided that I'd get a job in building control when I finish uni, do that for 2 or 3 years, then go work in the private sector, impart some of that knowledge, and I'd never left building control. So I started off at Wakefield Council, did about a year with them, and then I worked at Leeds City Council for a few years. Got to work on some fantastic projects, involved in the safety at sports ground team at Headingley Stadium. Did some knowledge sharing with some other sports grounds while I was there, and dealt with student accommodation. So you had this huge public event space in Headingley Stadium, which has a unique feature that it has a double-sided stand. So one side is cricket, and then on the back of that stand is the stand for the rugby stand. But you're also in student central, so there's HMOs, flats, student accommodation of various types. So it was a real mixed area to work in, and then what worked out to the suburbs as well. And then after that, I jumped into the private sector. So I worked for JHAI. I worked for a practice in London for a little bit, and then kind of spent 6 years working at Ascent. Worked for Butler and Young for a bit, and then did 6 years again at Ascent. So like half of my professional career was kind of working there. Most recently, I worked for Sweco, and then last summer I got the opportunity to kind of really move into the consultancy world. So finished full-time employment last September, and been working as a consultant predominantly for Hounsler Council in London as a team leader since then, and it's been a really, really interesting time.
Thank you, John. That's quite a journey, to be fair. The first work experience on your LinkedIn profile was architectural technician.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. So
Yeah.
why did you shift from architectural technician to going into building surveying?
I got a job when I was at uni. In our first year, we had to get a placement for a week whilst the other years were in exams. And I knocked on the door of an architectural practice and said, I've been doing construction at college. I know my way around CAD. Have you got any work experience for me? And they said yes. And then I worked for them part-time, worked in a pub. I've never not worked, but yeah, it's so yeah.
This is very similar to what I've done actually, because obviously I graduated from architectural engineering, and I've done the same thing. Same thing. I knocked on the door of an architecture practice on the high street where I used to live, and spent 9 years of my
Yeah,
career in there.
I think it's a really good ground. For me, it's been a really good grounding because you understand how designers see things come together, and you see how the legislation affects that design process, and sometimes where it doesn't. Sometimes where there's a conflict between the two.
Absolutely.
But I feel like it gave me quite a practical grounding, and then once I started in building control, you realise that in a week you can see more projects than you might work on in a year as an architect.
Oh yeah, 100%.
And you're picking up so much commonality, but there's so much difference as well. So you're building that knowledge base up, and it continues to this day, really.
So you've worked across both local authority, let's say both the private and the public sector over your career journey so far, and obviously our path has actually crossed during your time at Ascent. So what did moving between those two worlds teach you about the profession that you might not have picked up staying on one side rather than the other?
I think I've learned a lot going back into local authority, and a lot of things that hadn't necessarily been front and center as an RBI working in the private sector are more involved in the private sector. I think there's certain aspects of my role at a council which is more holistic than in the private sector. So we are pulled in and dealing with housing enforcement, planning enforcement, and it's one of the real strengths that I'm seeing within the team I'm working at now is that there's a real cross departmental approach in dealing with issues of substandard housing, and it's that joined up approach has been a real positive in that we can make sure that the building regulations are being followed and that people are provided with homes that are fit for purpose and they're going to be safe. And there's so many instances where we've been called in because there's poor levels of ventilation, poor levels of insulation, fire safety issues. And it's nice to see that as a team we're bringing that together. And I think sometimes in the private sector, although I didn't do huge amount of domestic work in the latter years of my career so far, is that there is trying to work up to that, work that process, and you can be quite siloed as that's not our function. We're just dealing with the building regs. That's pure and simple. And ultimately, as an RBI, we can only work within the framework of the building regulations. But there are other considerations that need to be brought in, and we're answerable to councillors and locally elected officials as well who want answers to queries so they can satisfy their constituents, so they can get a broader understanding of our role and our limitations, so that it's been a real eye-opener to be back in that environment. And I think sometimes people working in the private sector, maybe who haven't worked in the public sector for a long time, or have never worked in the public sector don't necessarily appreciate that kind of broad spectrum of responsibility that comes with working in the public sector.
Since you've gone back, have you found that allocating time for staff members being put on for dangerous buildings or different things like that have had to sort of change as they're not down as a restricted function or activity? So if you have like some bad weather, a lot of RBIs could be here, there and everywhere. Have they sort of adapted with that? Are different teams and councils helping with picking things up, or is it still predominantly down to building control to deal with dangerous buildings? Or
so we have a dangerous structures rota, and that we've got a number of RBIs on that rota, but it is a multidisciplinary approach to that. So there are contracting partners that work with the council, and we work across different teams to deliver that service. But we've had a few guys have gone out to fires and vehicles that have struck buildings, and it works really well. And we've got a couple of individuals who come from RBIs who have come from structural backgrounds as well. So it's all, we work really well. And although my role being a consultant, I'm not in the borough all the time, but I'm there as a on the end of a phone as somebody that can support the decision making process for the people on the ground. So it's we're quite lucky because it's not consistent across every local authority that there's that level of coverage. But we've got a good team where I'm at the minute, so it works well.
you mentioned some RBIs with backgrounds in structures. You were involved in structural warranties at Ascent. How would that differ in respect of being a normal working RBI? Obviously, it will be a little bit more of a different approach to dealing with the risks.
Yeah, I think the working with structural warranties it varies between different providers. Ned and myself, I don't know whether you have, Jack, but we'll have done warranty inspections for different providers, and some of them have different levels of requirements. Their approach to risk is quite different. And some of them have got a much more risk averse. So whether as an RBI we're satisfied that it complies with the regulations, they might have a different approach to that risk in terms of the way that things are constructed and the way that things are put together. Predominantly being things like flat roofs. A lot of warranty providers don't like flat roofs because the inherent risk of leak and whether that's going to happen in the defects period that the warranty covers. So you've always got that little step up in requirements in terms of what are the insurer's requirements over and above the regulations, and understanding that. And I think, I've had instances in my career where I've been an RBI on a project and there's been a third-party warranty provider, and there can sometimes be a conflict of, well, the warranty provider wants this, but you've said it's fine under building regs, and it is because it meets the functional requirements. But there is often that little bit of a gap in an insurer's appetite to risk compared to what meets the requirements of the regulations. And I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing. There is there's different loss. I think it's the Loss Prevention Council. They have for commercial buildings, they'll have a set of requirements that are over and above building regulations for insuring risks for certain commercial, industrial, storage buildings. So and the building regs are a minimum requirement. So I know, having listened to some of the previous podcasts, there's another industry podcast. I think we need to, if you use the warranty market as a bit of a benchmark, it takes things above the minimum. And I think there needs to be a change in mindset of when we're designing, or when designers are designing buildings and contractors are constructing buildings, is it shouldn't be what the minimum, the legislation. Someone once told me is we build buildings to the minimum level that we can get away with, rather than
True.
building
Every
to
day.
the best we can build.
True.
Because there's a perceived cost saving, but often you can see the buildings on the high street that have been built to a cost and those that have been built to last. And I think we need to be considering a much more holistic approach in terms of going beyond what's just a minimum standard. So,
And I think more than often the minimum is not even achieved.
no.
It's like it's an every day occurrence. If you go out on site and if you're visiting 5 sites, 1 out of those 5 would not achieve that minimum. They would get it wrong in a staircase riser in a communal
Yeah.
block, communal hallway in a block of flats. They'll get a height of a railway wrong. And it's quite simple.
Yeah.
And it's even laid out in approved documents in a very simple way. It's in tables. It's not like in code or anything like that.
And it's where, I've had it in the past where there's a cumulative an assumption that you can have an accumulative degradation of the standards. So, we've got this because that's a compensation for not having this. But then you go, well, you should have had that anyway. So it doesn't offer a compensation because all you were doing was achieving the minimum, but in another area you haven't. So there's a check and balance to be had across the regulations, and so you've got to demonstrate what you've done is reasonable, and that if you're deficient in one area, you've got to be beyond in another, but they've got to be relatable. And the easiest example of that is when you're dealing
Insulation.
with thermal regulations, and you've got using a whole building model to demonstrate that the overall energy performance is no worse, even though you've got some areas that may perform individually worse than the guidance suggests.
So, John, I'm gonna go back to something you've said right at the beginning of the podcast when you were introducing yourself. So I'm gonna go back to that. You said that you've spent there about 6 years, and then a gap, and then another 6 years in an organization that everyone is pretty much familiar with, which is Ascent.
Yeah.
So Ascent is something a lot of people in the industry still think about, and you were close to this world from where you sat. What do you think the sector took away from what happened? And are there any lessons that still haven't quite landed?
I think there's probably a lot of lessons that still haven't quite landed. First and foremost, I think Ascent was a business that gave me half of my professional career, there or thereabouts. It's a business that invested in me, and I feel like I invested myself back in that business, and it's something I'll always be thankful for. And a number of people along the way, Richard, Bat, John Dilly, the founders, originally took me on back in 2010, during a recession. Didn't need to, but they did. And, it's a business I'll always be thankful for. And some great people have been unfortunately caught up in a series of circumstances that I'm not fully abreast of. But, I think one of the things that we need to learn as an industry is that nobody's too big to fail. Ascent were the dominant player in the market for a number of years. And for whatever reason, it lost its way in the last 18 months, couple of years, and it's a real shame that a business that has been quite resilient, they've been well publicized issues previously, and I don't blame the businesses as those people running the business for some of those. There were individual errors, but I think it just lost its way, and I think it's difficult. And I think one of the things that the building control sector needs to do is to be probably much more collaborative. I know we've spoken before about that, and I think it needs to be that there needs to be a continuous recognition that although we might work for local authorities or RBCAs, or as consultants across the platform, that there's a common duty there, and we're serving members of the public. We are making sure that people are safe in and around buildings, and there should be much more collaboration between. So when things go wrong, I think the reversion process, the process of dealing with cancelled projects, and the impractically short time to transfer a project from one RBCA to another, which again was compounded by the legislation allows it, but was the appetite there from the insurers to be able to do it? I think there was a perception that some of it brought on risk, but then you should be able to rely on the legislation that these checks and balances in place in terms of transfer certificates and assessments of projects to make sure that any RBI and RBCA taking on the responsibility of delivering a project from one organisation to another they can do it. The legislation allows them to do it. They make their declarations, and there should be some trust in that process. I know, Nada, I dealt with one with you when I was at Hounsler, and we had a discussion over what the requirements were, and the information was provided, and it was done the right way. And I think, it's having those conversations.
Just having a conversation.
Yeah.
That's all it is. And I don't want to be repeating the same things, but collaboration and trying not the fragmentation within the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure that is siloed into organizations is not helping as well. If you've got only 7 days to transfer and you haven't got a system that is connected to another system and everything is done still analog, it's just quite difficult. It puts a lot of pressure on the entire industry.
Yeah, and I think if I think there was any learning from that, I think that period should extend, I would say, to something like 28 days. So you should be able to, as an RBI, you've got the confidence to know that you've got time to scrutinise that project that you've been asked to look after, and that you can deem whether that there is sufficient levels of compliance for you to be able to take that on, and that you're satisfied that it's a true representation of where you're told it's at. Because 7 days isn't enough, and I think on the whole, I think people have worked well to we haven't been a Hounslow. Wasn't a barrier to that process. I think if we had a discussion on the project, and he said, "Look, we've submitted the new notice. I'm working on the transfer documentation, but it's not going to be ready in 7 days because the amount of information." And we agree a timescale for that coming through, but the legislation does allow that, and I think
It does. Yeah.
we know it's working together. I think having it does highlight the lack of compatibility again in digital infrastructure. So all different building control bodies work within different IT infrastructure, and those systems aren't designed to talk to each other. So
that's what we're designing.
Yeah, I know, and I don't want to give you a shameless plug, but the Ascent system, the DCC system, is one of the best systems I've ever used.
Completely agree with that one. I do agree.
To the current day, the way that it managed the process and assisted the RBI in doing their day job was absolutely brilliant, and that's testament to the people that were instigated in the designing that system within that business. But it doesn't talk to the system that Hounsler use or the system that the organisation you represent used. So it's not like there's no digital service level agreement. So it's not like doing your transferring your bank in from one business to another. There's no because the way that data is managed isn't consistent. So I think there's probably some work that could be done within probably central government to standardise data, because not everyone's going to use the same platform. But if you had, especially now with KPIs and reporting, we've all got to report the same data back to the BSR. So there should be platforms should be under a certain requirements that are universal, and that means that data you could send a link from one system to another, and it will pull all the information from one system and put it into the next one seamlessly.
I don't want to reveal too much, but it's already designed. So when you've got the time, just type buildingcontrolportal.com. That's all you need to do.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about that after the podcast.
Yeah.
But this episode is sponsored by Plan Checker. Across building control and the wider construction sector, one issue keeps coming up: capacity. The work is there, the responsibility is huge, and the pressure keeps increasing. Plan Checker was built to help bridge that gap by making it easier to access independent, appropriately qualified professionals when support is genuinely needed. Whether that's for plan reviews, consultancy input, or specialist advice. It doesn't change statutory responsibility, and it doesn't interfere with regulatory routes. It simply helps people find expertise without relying on informal networks or last-minute phone calls. If you want to see how that works in practice, visit planchecker.co.uk.
There's questions on, there's already questions being raised whether there should still be a private sector or if that's going to go to a big national body. Do you think the long-term sustainability for private sector model is still a feasible system to use, or do you think it is looking towards going to a national building control body? Personally, I think having two separate sides still works and keeps each other on the toes for, being competition, but collaborative at the same time. Just because you compete against someone doesn't mean you can't work with them.
I think in the immediate to medium term, I think, even if I think of the long term, I can't foresee a day where there would be a single building control system again. I think, having worked as long as I have in building control, each part brings a unique set of something unique to the table. Sweco don't deal with domestic projects; they deal with commercial projects. They deal with it in a way that is very, low volume. They are, entirely client led, and that's their business model, and they work, and that suits that client base. And then you've got other RBCAs that are more broad brush, that deal with anything from domestic extensions up to HRBs or what were HRBs as large commercial properties. And then you get the kind of the local authorities deal with reversions, regularizations, enforcement, and I think the model will continue to work, but it does need more collaboration and it does need some refinement. I think there are more strengths than there are weaknesses in the system that we've got. In that, there's a huge amount of knowledge across both sectors, and I can't foresee. The genie's out of the bottle, and it's never going to go. We're never going to all get put back into a single national building control body. And I think, not that I can see anyway. I think that we're probably well on the road to having a national regulator, and I think people confuse the two. They think, national single construction regulator, that'll mean a national building control body, but having a national construction regulator is different to having a national building control body. The national construction regulator gives consistency across multiple parts of the industry. The stuff that HSE do, the stuff that central government now have set up the BSR effectively they've pulled the two apart, but if them two departments work under a national regulator that gives sets the tone, I think that's a bit like the SICARE did for the approved inspectors, and like the BSR are doing now. So I think it wouldn't surprise me that if we don't get a national regulator soon, but I think a national building control body is, there's a lot of investment being made in the building control sector, in the private sector. And the number of businesses that are investing in new people, in apprentices, and local authorities are doing it as well. But I think, there are strengths in the system that we've got now. I think maybe possibly it might lean towards local authorities performing more of a more enforcement-based function, but I think there's room for both the status quo to remain. I don't know what you guys think.
I agree. I don't think there's much point in taking away the private sector. I think if anything, a lot of RBIs would be lost because they wouldn't want to go back to a local authority, or they might never have worked at one and don't really fancy it.
Yeah.
It would be too much of a risk to lose a lot of good people that are quite happy where they are and enjoy what aspects they do. Maybe they don't want to be involved in enforcement or dangerous buildings, and it's
the market and the land is wide enough and big enough to accommodate all sides. That's my opinion. There's and competition. Competition is healthy. If you look at it in a collaborative way, it's very healthy, and it drives both sides to perform to the best interest
Mm.
of the public, which we all
Yeah.
are supposed to be doing. We're all our function and our purpose is the same.
Yeah. It's you know, sometimes you have to remind clients that as much as they are, you know, they're the customer facing customer, you know, we're a servant to the public and the regulations. So sometimes the client are going to be told things that they don't necessarily want to hear, because we work, you know, the regulations are the things we work to rather than the brief of the client. You know, I'm not unrealistic in that you've got to, you know, we're in a commercial environment, and that but you need to, I think sometimes people need to remember that what the regulations are there for and who they're there to represent. And it's, you know, we've seen too often, not just in the UK, but across the world, where major fatalities in buildings are caused by people neglecting to understand and to adhere to regulation. You know, buildings are generally safe until you put people in them, and that's what the regulations are there to do, is to fill that gap and make buildings safe where people are in and about them. So
You've
yeah,
stole my line twice now. It's usually
have
me
I?
to keep people safe in their own buildings.
That's Jack's favorite line.
Yeah, I think people forget because and it's easy to become siloed in the approach, and I think, you know, it's probably one of my criticisms of the current. You know, you've talked about pulling, you know, private sector back into the public sector, and you can look at the current issues around the delivery of HRBs and how that has become a little bit fragmented, and I dare I say siloed. In, you know, MDTs aren't necessarily always MDTs because everybody does their own little bit in their own silo, and I think you know, we've seen RBIs leave the industry because they don't the registration process, and
They don't agree with how
yeah, and
it's. With how
I don't mind the registration. I don't mind being a you know, a restricted function and a registered building inspector. I think it adds strength to our role. I think it's a tool in our armory that we didn't have before. But I think one of the things that the Hackett report highlighted is that sometimes the regulations are siloed, but I think currently the way that the regulations are executed can be a little bit siloed as well. And I think we need to, if I could introduce one thing to the BSR tomorrow, would be something like, when you get an MDT established for the delivery of a project, the first thing you do is to set up a meeting with the BRPD, and they introduce the scheme to you, to the MDT, and they explain the reasons why. Effectively, they run through the rationale for that project, so everybody walks away with an understanding of what the intent is to deliver that project, and then that is sets a good foundation for the RBI checking it, the engineer checking it, the fire teams checking it, and whoever else is involved with that MDT panel. I think it'd be a real strength, and it wouldn't take a lot of time, and it'd move things along. I would hope.
Well,
All the
hopefully some
questions.
PSR would be listening and they take up that suggestion. Sorry, Jack, to cut you off.
No, go on. One of the questions which we had was how you've had a bit of full circle heading back into local authority in a contracting role. How you've touched on it a bit so far, but how's that sort of felt moving back into it? Do you feel like you've slotted in quite well, and it's just a bit of differences that you're now getting back into with enforcement and parts of the legislation?
I feel like, I feel like I've slotted in quite well. I think it is getting back into the swing of things with things like enforcement, demolition notices, dealing with all the ancillary things that the local authorities tend to have to pick up that are not necessarily seen by RBIs that maybe work predominantly in the private sector. And it's been really good. I've been fortunate enough to be able to use that cumulative knowledge I've gained over the last 20 years working predominantly in the private sector and impart that back into working in a local authority, and it's been really good. And the feedback I've had from the team that I work with has been really positive, and they've recognised that I've come from the private sector, and that there's a mutual respect, and it's something I've really enjoyed. I think 2 years ago, it's something that I wouldn't have necessarily seen myself doing, but I think there's so much has gone on within the building control sector, and I think one of the if you look at again, go back to like the BSR model with MDTs. It's quite if you strip it back, it's quite an agile model. You bring in a resource where you need it to deliver a function and a service, and it's kind of best RBI for that project, not necessarily just because they're in that authority that's their project, regardless of their kind of level of competence. And it creates quite an agile workforce. And I think having the ability to work as a local authority as a contractor, and to be able to have that flexibility has been a really good thing. And I think I can see there being more agile working within the building control sector. And that again is another strength of being registered building inspectors, is that you hold an individual registration that isn't bound to the RBCA or to the local authority. That is your registration. It's for you to maintain. And you've got to align yourself with how best you want to see yourself retaining that registration and how you want to grow that registration. So yeah, I think I could see more hybrid working for different, across the sector, that there'll be some local authorities with, a mixture of employed and contract workers, and same in the private sector. And there'll be some people that do a bit of both,
Couldn't agree more.
because it's, and it's no different than the contractors in the construction sector, or freelance graphic designers, or freelance architects, or freelance marketing consultants. You work for multiple clients delivering a professional function. And I think going back into LA, it's something that I'm more than happy to continue working in a local authority environment. I don't see it as I don't see any negative in doing that. It's been good, Jack. I think it's another string to my bow as an RBI.
One of the topics, John, that you flagged up whilst we're talking about being back in LA, building notices.
Yeah.
How do you see them sitting within the new regulatory landscape? Has anything meaningfully shifted, or is it still work in progress?
I struggle with building notices. I think they are an antiquated method of trying to achieve compliance, because it sits counter to everything else now. You know, that the designer should demonstrate they've got the competence and, you know, to be able to deliver a design, and the contractor's got to be competent to build it. But on a building notice, you don't have to demonstrate anything of that up front. You don't have to, you know, and an RBI is always going to be on the back foot when dealing with a building notice. And I don't think that doesn't align itself with, you know, the Building Safety Act in function or in principle, I think. And it's a shame that we're still as local authorities were still burdened by them. We get plenty of work in as building notices, and sometimes people will, you know, they do submit the supplementary information, they do submit, you know, structural calcs, but more often than not, it's something that you arrive on site and you're ending up having to ask for retrospectively because someone's just ploughed on and done what they feel is right. And I'm not necessarily saying it's not compliant, but I'm saying it creates a bureaucratic burden on the RBI, and they're not the ones that need to demonstrate compliance. it's those that are carrying out the work.
It just opens the door for people to be relying for advice from the RBI when we can't necessarily be given design advice, and that's how I've found dealing with building notices all the time. With people just think it's a quick way to start immediately and then worry about the consequences later and hope that we'll just guide them through the whole mess.
Yeah, and it doesn't end well when that happens, and it puts a lot of pressure on the RBI, because if you end up ultimately having to take enforcement action, a lot of the evidence is based on your site inspections, because there's not much supplementary information because it's not been provided, or it's substandard. So it makes it really difficult. I think, you know, if we could eliminate building notices, it'd do great things for
everyone,
for the building control sector. Yeah, and you know, RBCAs can't work on building notices. Counter to some of the conversations I've had in dealing with some projects over my career, there's always examples of going, oh, well, we just submitted a form and very little other than a planning drawing. But those days, you know, the legislation is quite clear that those that are carrying out work need to demonstrate that work complies, and a building notice just isn't aligned to that function. And
no, I think they need to go. If for it to all work within the legislation, your principal designer provides a compliant design, it's checked by the RBI, which is the restricted activity, and then we go to site and do what we do on site, which is another restricted activity by the principal contractor, who should have the skills and experience behaviours to perform their duties. The building notice just totally takes away the whole point of that from having a principal designer. I don't understand why it's still there.
I don't know how I would deal with a building notice. I've not worked in a public sector before, but John, you know how I am.
Yeah,
In our time working together, I issued a lot of contraventions,
yeah,
and
yeah.
we had to deal with that together. And today I'm issuing contraventions under Part 2A.
Yeah.
Because I believe some duty holders are not actually demonstrating that the appropriate competence, knowledge, behavior, and experience.
But I think that this is where I know we've talked about it, and it seems to be, it's not just a buzzword, but it falls back to, learnings from the Ascent thing as well, is that the collaboration aspect, and that as an industry, we set the standard, and we set a consistent standard, and we don't need to be told what that standard is, because we know what it is, and it's ingrained into what we do. So, RBCAs shouldn't be accepting planning drawings and a one-page specification for a submission, because that's not the principal designer demonstrating that that scheme is compliant. Just as much as local authorities, should be doing the same, and if we can, and there's no reason why, as local authorities, and I did some work for Thanet District Council, and that was, as a plan checking process. And I'd work with their administrative team, and they say, oh, we've got a building notice in for this. And I'd look at, and they'd want a fee for it, because there's quite a, cumulative amount of work that doesn't fit within the fee schedule. And you look at it and go, this isn't a building notice. It needs full plans. And there's some planning drawings, but as an RBI, there's too much going on for me to be able to determine compliance, and not, because there's no plan, there's no specification, there's no rationale for what's being done. It's basically what you see on the day when you get there, and how you can piece that jigsaw together as to determine a level of compliance. And that's, that's counter to, that puts us at risk as RBIs, because if you don't see something because there's too much going on,
we're not there every day.
No. And that's what, I once had a conversation with somebody, and I said they had a complaint that something hadn't been picked up. Oh, we found this and it's not compliant. Your person's been out on site and they've missed it. And this was before the Building Safety Act kicked in. And I said, well, for your project, we spend maybe 4 or 5 hours. We do the plan check. We respond to the feedback and the comments. And then we do inspections, and there's 8 inspections. So between the 8 inspections and the plan check, we maybe spend between 25 and 30 hours on your project over its, from commencement to completion. You've got a builder that's there every day who has a responsibility to make sure his work complies. And you might have, if it's more than just, it might have a project manager on it as well, working with that builder. And then there'll be subcontractors that are tied to the scheme. There's an architect who spent time designing the scheme. So, and if it takes 6 months to deliver that project on site, where should the responsibility for gaps in compliance lie? It's not with a person that spent less than a week dealing with that project over its length. And some say, well, you should be there more often. But then that's indicative of an undervalued service, and dare I say, historically low local authority fees compared to private sector fees. Even back in,
it's not our role to be there be there more often. We're not project managers, we're not clerk of works, none of that.
So it's, I think, and that opens up other roles within industry for those RBIs that maybe don't want to be carry out restrictive function, but you could be there as a compliance monitoring on behalf of a client to provide third party assurance that the work that they're doing is compliant, to help them with that evidence of compliance. So they're trying to get back to where we started from, but I think it's not down. It comes back to the building notices. They're not aligned with our function, and I think if there can be, people can be braver in saying this isn't a building notice; it needs to be a full plans application. And
so in simple words for people listening, so in your opinion, obviously that's not expressing the entire industry's opinion.
No. The views
Just
of
to
my
clarify,
own, not of anyone that I happen
Not
to
just
be.
to clarify, so a building notice is not in line with the current regulatory framework.
No.
Let's put it that way.
No.
Okay.
It's counter to. It puts RBIs at risk, and that's not. It's just not like, we've done too much to in developing a restricted function and going through competence assessments to a building notice to be the weak link in the in the process. And I think I would recommend to those at the powers that be that they review it, and maybe it's not it's not dismissed totally, but there are very, very limited defined in legislation functions of what a building notice can cover. So, like, you can build a house on a building notice, but you can't, because there's so many things you need to provide before you start work on site. It just counters to what's in Part L, and it just
you can't. It counters everything. Things that needs to be submitted 5 working days before and things like that. How can you do that with a building notice? Of course, John, you've been in this profession for over 2 decades now, so you've seen it change enormously, and you're still very much in the middle of it. So I'm a bit curious. Both of us are curious. What is it that still drives you to remain?
No 2 days are the same.
Good. All right. What else?
I think the Building Safety Act has been a bit of a regulatory reset. I think we aren't the same sector we were. There's so many similarities, but we aren't the same. We're not doing the same job we were doing 5 years ago. It's changed, and the challenge is to meet that change. And building inspectors have always met the challenge. I think we're the ones that deal with regulatory changes first. The people come to us to say, Part L's changed, what do I need to do? I came in 2002, and people were wondering how you could possibly build a wall that had a U value of 0.35 when it was 0.45 before, and it wasn't going to work. And roof insulation with it just 0.25, and it just wasn't practical. And we meet those challenges, and it's probably recognised that we were the first to demonstrate our competence within the sector, because we can meet as an industry. We roll with the changes, and we meet them head on. I see it. You just made me think about comparables. You think about like motorsport. We're on the eve of the new Formula 1 season. Sorry if you're not listening to this. Well, we'll have passed the start of the new Formula 1 season. But it goes through regulatory evolution, and it's the same sport, but the approach can be quite different, and you're working within a different set of parameters. But ultimately, the aim is the same: it's to win. It's to be the best.
Unless you're Aston Martin.
Yeah. Yeah, you've got the best technical brains in the industry, but yet you've got the worst car. But we'll see. people could be listening to this in the summer, sat by the swimming pool and thinking, what were they on about? The leaps that pulled it out of the bag. But yeah, I think I've been becoming a business owner. You have to do things like get insurance for being a company director and how you manage your business, and should you meet an untimely demise and all those type of things. And people talk about retirement age, and I don't see. I love what I do. I love speaking to designers. I love going on site. I think problem solving, and I don't see that changing. So yeah, I feel like it's and there's loads. We're only at the start of a new evolution of this sector. You look at the roles that are available through recruiters, and you look at the roles that are available across the industry. There's a number of contractors and developers that have been asked to want RBIs as part of their management team in delivering projects so they can mitigate risk. They want to appoint consultant RBIs to mitigate risk pre-tender, to fill that gap in where historically maybe building control professionals would get an application in, you plan check it pre-tender, you give them a steer of whether it's compliant or not, and then it'd go to tender, a contractor would win it, it'd go somewhere else. I think there's an evolution now because of the restricted functions that we have, that people don't necessarily want to give that pre-tender because it could be perceived to give a steer in design if you don't think it's compliant. That's where a consultant comes in that's independent of the process. And so I think there's lots of different things that are still to happen within the building control sector, and I'm excited that I think despite the low numbers of people, I think it's a really exciting sector to work in. I'd recommend it. You hear about plenty of disillusioned architects about being unhappy about being underpaid, and there's too many architects and not enough work. And if there are any architects listening that like to understand how things go together and like to see a project through, and like the legislative part of delivering a project, I'd highly recommend a career in building control because
I switched from architects.
Yeah, and it gives that another perspective. It does, and the same people working in contractors. If you can deliver a project from a hole in the ground to a finished building and liaise with all the subcontractors and meet the program deadlines and satisfy the needs of the client, then working in building control you'd find it really rewarding. I think it's a fantastic career to come into, and I wouldn't, I don't see the being a restrictive function and being a registered RBI as being a negative, as something that you could, I think it's a real positive that it upholds a standard, and I think things can only get better if we work together within the sector. So,
Spot on. John, thank you for joining us today and for taking the time out to speak with us. One massive question to ask, which I'm sure all the listeners will want to know: who's going to win the constructors and who's going to win the drivers' championship?
Constructors, I think, will go to from my early catch up this morning over my cup of coffee to see what happened overnight. And for the I wouldn't say scintillating performance, but I think consistent and high standards have been met. I think Ferrari for the constructors, but I think
Did you see that one, John?
unlucky. And I think maybe another Brit. I think maybe George Russell for the Drivers' Championship.
I can see Russell. I'd like to see Hamilton get his ninth.
Yeah.
But
those Ferraris look very quick off the mark. So
they do.
Yeah.
Well,
We
John,
shall see.
No, really, same as Jack said. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being so open with us and obviously giving your time to us today. As always, great conversation, and I'm sure everyone out there will enjoy listening to it. Just a quick brief, where can people find you or follow you, see what you're up to? If someone, obviously you're a director of your own consultancy firm,
Yes.
Ada Gray. So what's the details of Ada Gray? So if anyone wants some consultancy advice or anything like that, how can they find you?
So Ada Gray Consulting is my limited company I set up with my wife. You can find me on LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest place to find me. That's got all my details on. And
we'll put some of the details as well up on the screen. And well, John, hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us. And whoever's listening, thank you very much for listening to our podcast. Keep on listening. And more to come.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thanks.
This episode of Behind the Regs is sponsored by Plan Checker. Plan Checker is a UK-based digital platform designed to connect clients with verified building control and construction professionals, making it easier to find the right expertise at the right time for the right job. It doesn't replace building control bodies, and it doesn't carry out restricted activities or functions. It simply creates clearer, more transparent access to the professionals working across the industry. If you're a professional, a client, or part of the wider built environment sector, you can learn more or sign up at planchecker.co.uk.